All right, so I am presenting or recording my presentation titled Sleep as a Moderator Between the Relationship of Stressful Life Events and Depressive Symptoms. The authors are as such. My name is Christian Serrano. I'm the main author on this presentation, or for this poster presentation. Maiko Saraju, Bachelor's of Science, and Emily Wan, Bachelor's of Science, have been two staff RAs that are in my lab that have helped me the most throughout this entire process of creating the poster. So I want to thank them, and then of course my mentor, Dr. Melinda Casement, and the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon. All right, let's get into it. All right, well here's my poster, everyone. Again, titled "Sleep as a Moderator Between the Relationship of Stressful Life Events and Depressive Symptoms." I'm going to take you guys throughout the entire thing, and it should be good. So, start off with my introduction. So, we know that depression and anxiety are among the leading causes of illness and disability among adolescents, and that's according to the World Health Organization. On top of that, childhood adversity has been long linked to lasting mental health consequences, including increased risk for depressive symptoms in adolescence and adulthood. So, in other words, the more stressful life events a adolescent goes through early on in their life, the more likely they are to have depressive symptoms characterized usually around young adulthood. And then finally, we know that sleep disturbances have been shown to play a significant role in the development of mood disorders. So we know that these three things, stress, depression, and sleep, all intertwine with one another, but we don't know to what extent within the population of adolescents. And that's essentially what my project is about. So here's a quick little research paradigm to characterize how, or the relationship that I'm talking about. So we have sleep duration / midpoint moderating the relationship of specifically stress severity and depressive symptoms. So my aim one, I wanted to examine the moderating role of sleep midpoint and duration on the relationship of cumulative life stress and depressive symptoms. And then my hypothesis one, being short sleep duration and late sleep midpoint will exacerbate depressive symptoms in adolescents who have higher levels of exposure to stressful life events. So going on to my methods. I am pulling data from 64. I'm pulling data from 64 participants from an ongoing study at the University of Oregon. The study titled "Mechanisms of Depression and Anhedonia in Adolescents," or as we like to call it at the lab, the MODA study. We are pulling adolescents, or our population consists of adolescents, so our population is 14 to 18 years old with a mean of 16 years old and a standard deviation of 1.28. And the population is also elevated for depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and a history of stress and adversity. But to even get within, or to get into the study, participants need to fall within two groups. Our first group is going to be our bad sleepers, or what we like to call our owls. And these are individuals who sleep less than or equal to 7 hours and have a bedtime of 10:30 or past 10:30. And then we have our good sleepers, which we call our larks, who have a sleep duration of more than 7 hours and a bedtime of 10:30 or earlier. So that is the criteria to get into the study. They also can't have any sort or specific mental health issues or illnesses such as bipolar. They can't have narcolepsy. So those are just a couple things that we screen out for. They also need to be eligible to have a MRI, so they can't have any metal within their bodies. So going on to speaking more about my sample is predominantly white. We are pulling from Eugene, Oregon. But we have a pretty even split between our participants, 46.9% being female, 45.3% being male, and then 7.8% identifying as other. So going to my measures, specifically for my depression anxiety scales, I use the Promise Pediatric Depression Scale and the Promise Pediatric Anxiety Scale. These are both short form surveys, each consisting of 8 questions. Each question outputs a score, and so what I did to get to use this variable is I summed up all the scores for that survey, and then I create a cumulative life score from that. How I measured stress, I use the Stress and Adversity Inventory, otherwise known as STRAIN, who was developed by a professor, Dr. Slavic, at the UCLA. And this is going to measure cumulative stress, severity, and count. This is a much longer survey. It consists of a plethora of different questions that assess chronic and acute stressors, and this assesses the entirety of an adolescent's life. Yes, So the two main scores that this measure is going to output is the cumulative stress, the stress severity score and the stress count score. For this posture specifically, I use stress severity. However, in my full analysis and in my thesis paper, I will be talking about stress count as well. And then finally, for my sleep variable, I use actigraphy-derived sleep metrics. So this is essentially, we have participants come into the lab and we distribute this device called a motion logger. And what this motion logger does is it collects light and motion data. And from that, we can tell when a participant goes to bed from this data. So we can see when all the lights are off, when they completely stop moving, and then they can also press event markers or this button that leaves an event marker, which tells us when they reported them going to bed. So we need 5 to 7 days, a minimum of 5 days, to calculate a total sleep time and a midpoint of their data. So that is how we got that. And then I'm covariating for age, gender, as well as anxiety. For my analysis, I'm using a simple linear regression with with total sleep time or sleep midpoint as the moderator. So going on to my results. Table 1 is descriptors of all my measures used in the analysis. So again, age 16.03. We have a mean of that. Stress count, and stress severity. For stress count specifically, I wanted to mention or point out that there's a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 91. And then for stress severity, there's a minimum of 1 again, and then a maximum of 186. So there's a wide range where participants can fall within this range. And then the mean for both of those for stress count is 29.12 and stress severity is 61.20. Another thing I wanted to highlight is the total sleep time mean that is at 7.57, so practically 7.5 hours. So our adolescents are getting a pretty healthy amount of sleep. They're almost to the full 8 hours, however, they're just short. And then last thing I want to mention is my sleep midpoint, and that's going to be an hour, so 3.98. That's supposed to represent 3 in the morning, what would that be? 3:55, let's say, in the morning. So that is the middle of their sleep. So most of our adolescents are sleeping at around midnight. So going on to my first figure, this figure characterizes the relationship of stress severity and depressive symptoms, and then uses total sleep time as the moderator for this linear regression model. The 3 lines are going to represent long total sleep time, average total sleep time, and short total sleep time, with long and short being denoted as +1 and -1 standard deviation above and below the mean. And as we can see here, there's no interaction, or meaningful interaction, I should say. We had a p-value of 0.209. So a little unfortunate there. However, I do want to kind of direct your eyes to that group of data that's right by the lines. And I'll speak more about that after my next figure. My next figure is looking at the exact same thing. However, instead of total sleep time as the moderator, we have sleep midpoint. And this interaction is just as worse, or worse than the last one. The lines are practically on top of one another. If we wanted to see an interaction effect, obviously the lines would spread out a lot more, and there would be a different relationship there. However, a p-value equaled out to 0.785, so there's no meaningful relationship. However, I do want to group your eyes again to that cluster of data that's right at the 0 stress severity mark and the 20 on the depressive symptoms y-axis. There seems to be a lot of data grouped right there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this and my limitations. However, I did have a small sample size, but I'm thinking that if I had a larger sample size, this data would show more promising results, I should say. However, in conclusion, the overall models were significant. I had an adjusted R-square of 0.57 to 0.58 for both my models. Stress severity, anxiety, and age emerged as significant predictors of depressive symptoms, which reflects previous research. Contrary to my hypothesis, sleep duration and midpoint did not moderate the relationship between stress severity and depressive symptoms. However, again, stress severity, anxiety, and age emerged as consistent predictors of depressive symptoms. So it was cool to see that my research replicated what previous research has found too. And then going on to my limitations/future research section. Again, like I said before, I had a relatively small sample size, an N of 64. This is going to limit my statistical power for meaningful moderation effects. Again, this data is pulled from an ongoing study, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a little bit. Prior literature suggests that sleep does play a crucial role in emotional recovery from stress in adolescents, but particularly when sleep is sleep problems are more persistent. So what my research looked is we looked at a snapshot of a adolescent's sleep within a week. Excuse me. Whew. Yeah, we looked at a snapshot of an adolescent's sleep behavior within any given week, and that isn't going to, I guess, characterize the sleep relationship that I would like it to. So that is also another limitation. Um, when I was conducting my literature review, I found that a lot of the studies that I was looking at looked at a healthy population of adolescents. My population reports elevated depressive, anxiety, and stress symptoms, um, and this can bias the data in any sort of way. So of course, it's going to be a little bit different than a much more healthy population. And then, of course, future research should examine larger samples and consider longitudinal designs to capture persistent sleep problems over time, as cumulative sleep disturbance may be more significant than the average of sleep duration and midpoint. So that is pretty much my poster. I also wanted to mention that this is, again, like I mentioned before, that this is an ongoing study at the University of Oregon titled MODA. In the bottom right, you can see a QR code with a title above it that says project website. If you scan that, that'll take you to the project website, and then you can find a lot more about the study. This is a very, very vague snapshot of what the main study is. The main study has way more variables. We do neuroimaging data. We also look at heart monitoring devices. We have a lot more variables and measures for the full study. However, for this project specifically, I'm just looking at sleep, stress, and depressive symptoms. And then I also have a QR code for my references. I wanted to give a huge shout out to, again, Maya Kosaraju, Emily Wan, and Dr. Melinda Casement. They have all been such a huge help within this entire process. And then I'm also part of the McNair Scholars Program here at the University of Oregon. So I want to give another huge shout out to Dr. Christabel Dragu, and Denise Elder. They are some of the most incredible people out there, and I couldn't be more grateful that I'm able to work with them while I'm in college. But thank you everyone for listening and watching to me talking about my poster. I hope it was relatively exciting. But yes, thank you.